Hello, I'm Daniel Siegel, and together with Karl Grün from Austrian Standards, today we're going to talk about how standards also affect the software industry, because we have the feeling this is something that is not typically on the radar of most software companies.
So, also a nice hello, my name is Karl Grün, and I'm looking forward to present together with Daniel how standardization can boost the scale-up.
So a short introduction of myself. I'm involved with building tools for engineers since roughly 1999. I'm currently business development at Syntevo, the makers of SmartKit. But very interesting for today's discussion, probably I'm the Deputy Director for Standards at Incosi, a worldwide organization of systems engineers, where it's all about the standards where hardware meets electronic, meets software, where new products like cars or aircrafts are developed. And I chaired several working groups at ProStep, a standardization organization focused on automotive. And I'm also involved with OMG, old school standards organization from the software industry that is still kicking.
So I'm working in Austrian Standards, the recognized national standardization body in Austria since 1994. I'm the Deputy Managing Director of Austrian Standards, and I have several functions not only in Austria. For example, I'm member of various advisory boards like the Austrian Computer Society, but also member of the AI Stakeholder Forum of the Austrian federal government. And on international level, Austrian Standards is the member of the European Committee for Standardization CEN, where I am the representative in the technical board of CEN, as well as the just recently created Board Standing Committee on Policy and Strategy.
So why did people invent standards? Very interesting, and maybe a topic that fits well into today's time. It was developed to simplify trade. And one of the very first standards that was developed was the meter in France. And this was already in 1791, so it's a pretty long time. And many standards like the liter were derived from this meter standard that was developed in France.
Yes, indeed, and we could even track back the idea of standardization back to the Stone Age, where the people said, okay, we have to find order in the chaos, but in the modern time, the idea is not to reinvent the wheel, but more important is to have a same language to understand each other, which is more than important than ever in today, when we consider geopolitical changes. And here I have presented on the right side here what Daniel already said, the length of things where we have the so-called Elle, and you see this part smiley emoji, which is a shape where the bakery can put their bread on it and see, is this size standardized? And if not so, the bakery will be put down to the Danube River and thrown into the water. And in modern time, you see here what will happen when things don't understand each other. And there was a Mars probe, the climate orbiter, which was lost in translation due to several components exchanging data. But what not was considered is that this data had different systems, so meters with inches, kilobonds with Newton and so on. And the result was that this climate orbiter, which costed $125 million US, was, due to the loss in translation, lost in space.
Interestingly, if you buy a non-metric screw in America, they call it standard, which is kind of weird for us Europeans. One of the things where standards also played a big role, and where you can see that sometimes open sourcing stuff is better than patents, is probably the shipping container. Shipping containers were invented to be less exposed to unions loading and unloading ships. But the first approaches went pretty bad because every shipping container company designed their own shipping container and they were incompatible. So you still needed the unions to load stuff from one container to the other. When you, for example, had goods shipped from Chicago to New York, it might happen that you have somewhere a port where you need to repack containers to continue the journey. The standard for shipping containers that won was the first company that gave up on their patents and basically open sourced their design before the Vietnam War, where the Department of Defense took on massive on shipping containers. And on the way back, the ships would collect goods in Japan, and this was kind of the start of the globalization as we know it today. Why do standards matter for software engineers? And this might be a bit dramatic, but standards define the state of the art. And the state of the art is a term that has legal consequences. The legal consequences might be if an accident or a cybersecurity incident happens, it might be the difference between going to jail or not going to jail. And in automotive, in banking, everywhere this really matters. So standards also help to define the state of the art. So you know what is good engineering practice, and when you go with good engineering practice, your liability is much better than if you do what you want.
So indeed, standards provide a certain added value. And as explained by Daniel, there are other added values when you use standards. For example, standards foster the scalability of solutions. So even in concepts like lot size 1, where you have modules, where you can arrange these modules following this lot size 1 approach. But more important, to ensure interoperability between systems from different vendors, so make your overall system not depending from one single vendor, which otherwise put this single vendor in a not appropriate, or let's say not fair competition situation with other competitors. It's also about, as explained before, that standards provide a common terminology recognized broadly on the market, so it promotes a common understanding, for example, how good looks like. It is also the case that when you use standards, apply them, that you have in the standards standardized, broadly accepted levels of security, but also of quality, and that means that when you have product, services, solutions in compliance with standards, you create trust on the market. Not to reinvent the wheel, as already said, means that you can put your human spirit to other things, and that creates room for innovation and technology progress. And when you put your wisdom into a standard in a round table, we will come later to how a standard is created. That means that a standard is a perfect channel for the dissemination of recognized knowledge into the market. That also can be seen in the framework of knowledge valorization. So creating added value through standards, that's what standards are for.
And I think this is a very good start for this slide, which is blank, because standards are typically created on a blank sheet of paper. It starts with letter of intents, so typically more than one organization expressing written interest in a standard. And then a standards body is chosen or was chosen already before. And then committee work starts. Boardroom meeting starts, joint writing session starts, and some standards can really take a long time to evolve. From my work, SysML v2 is a standard where I watched closely, and it took 7 to 8 years to create the standard from scratch, so a rather long period. There is ISO standards. that are even more formalized. Sometimes they can be done in 2 to 3 years. Some take a bit longer. And this is really how global standards are created. And sometimes this is really too slow. Other times it might be a perfect fit. There is also people nowadays that create standards on GitHub, fully open. One example is the FMI standard, the functional mockup interface, which is used in software for simulation exchange. So you can use, for example, MATLAB to create a simulatable artifact, and you can use an ANSYS tool to use this artifact. And this is a standard largely pushed by the industry, and it's completely open and available on GitHub for reuse or creating issues against it and so on.
So when we speak about standards and standardization, there are certain principles we need to consider when something is standardized. These principles are laid down in the so-called technical codex of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, on the technical barriers to trade. And the concept of this codex is to remove technical barriers to trade due to standards. So this sounds a little bit strange, because in former time a standard was elaborated in a nation to keep others outside of the market of this state. But in a modern economy, we need to collaborate, and this can be done by standards, especially international standards. And standardization is nothing else than an established ecosystem, where this ecosystem is based on the before mentioned principles, which are to be inclusive, to be open for everybody. So especially those stakeholders who have a stake in the topic, which is subject to a standardization project, to ensure transparency so that everybody knows what is now subject to a standardization project, to be able to join this standardization project, especially to ensure that everybody is treated on an equal basis. That means that the process is fair and that not one single party can overrule others. That means this process is based on consensus, which means to speak to each other, convince each other, but not to put pressure on somebody. So the standard is elaborated, as Daniel said. First, we need an idea. Something needs to be standardized, and here I come back to the added value of standards to define, for example, the quality of system-based engineering. What is a sound, good system-based engineering to ensure the interoperability between systems from different vendors, to ensure that solutions are compatible with each other, to ensure that the solutions are scalable, and especially speaking about international markets. So we have a solution developed in a certain country to internationalize this solution. So these are the ideas behind a standardization idea. This standardization idea is then brought to the standardization body, where you have, and that's also my remark, you have to check what is the standardization body, what is the policy, the governance of the standardization body. For example, does it have an IPR policy and so on? So to avoid that you run into problems like patents, proprietary standards versus open standards. And standardization bodies like Austrian Standards or the European Committee for Standardization, CEN, ISO, etc., they are so-called open standardization bodies. So these standardization bodies then assess the idea, put it on a vote so that everybody has the right to cast a vote, to express the opinion. Does it make sense to work on such a topic in the standardization framework? And if the people say, yes, it makes sense because here we have a clear benefit, which is of mutual benefit for everybody, the project is accepted. It will be included in the work program of the standardization committee. Everybody is invited to join the work on a fair basis, on a round table. Everybody has the same right and the same voting right. And then when in the engine of such a standardization body, the content of such a document is elaborated, it will be brought to the attention of the public, which is the so-called public inquiry phase. So those who don't have the resources which are needed to work within this engine room have the right to express feedback on the content. This feedback is then resolved by the standardization committee, and our answers are given to the feedback, to those who have provided the feedback, and especially to check, is this content suitable for the market? For example, does it comply with law? Is it achievable, the solution in economic terms, etc.? So different aspects here need to be considered. And then when these feedbacks are resolved, the quality of the content is enriched, and then the standard is published and disseminated into the market, which means the market uptake. And you have spoken, Daniel, about the average development time. Here we have a clear goal, which means a standard is not elaborated to put on the shelf, but needs to be disseminated into the market. So time to market is very critical. And here we have several initiatives to accelerate the process, but not put on risk the principles like inclusiveness, openness, stakeholder involvement, transparency, and consensus. So here to find the right balance.
Karl, what would be a good time to create an ISO standard from scratch?
From scratch, I would say first we need a preparatory work, so to see, okay, what is already available, to collect it, to assess it, to have, look, standardization is nothing else like project management. First, you need to find, okay, what's the scope of the project, who are the stakeholders, what is the environment, in economic terms, environmental, etc. So first you need to do your homework before you start with the standard. And then you can see, okay, here we have already available resources like specifications from others, how we can put them together, what's the all, if we for example, if we need to define that the solution needs to be technology neutral, we can of course not accept a specification from one single vendor, but first we need to prepare the project. And if this is done, we can define or elaborate the standard very quickly, and I would say 1.5 year, 2 year maximum. That's a sound development time.
Okay.
But we can say if the technology is not mature enough, so in terms of technology readiness level, then we have also other types of standardization deliverables. I don't want to go into detail, but to confuse you, we have technical specifications, workshop agreements, etc., which are elaborated much quicker.
Okay.
And you have also said, okay, standards define the state of the art, or at least are in the context of the state of the art. And here you see the technology development, the progress in technology, versus the standard, the lifetime of a standard. So when the standard is published, it should be the state of the art, at least one, but it's, again, you have other means to demonstrate that your solution is state of the art. So we have rules of the state of the art. So it's a kind of Babylonian, how you'd say, confusion. So standards are not state of the art, they are codified state of the art, and there are other sources, also resources available to codify the state of the art. But over the time, you see the state of the art is increasing, but you have also innovations, so novel solutions which are above state of the art, and standards are reviewed systematically. So every 5 years we have the systematic review to assess, are there technology changes which are not reflected well in the standard, then the standard needs to be revised. So it will be upgraded to a new version going above the state of the art. So then we have a new standard, and then it's applied. And when, again, the systematic review is started, we can say, okay, we have to revise it again. And in the revision of the standard, but also in the initial phase, we also take into account findings from innovation. And here you can see also some examples, since we are speaking here about the International B2B Software Days, where standards come into play with all other domains. Our task or our mission as standardization body is bringing communities together. So we have the software community, but we have also other communities, for example, construction sector, machinery, medical sectors, etc. And here you can see that just the recent areas where we have, for example, smart cities, so communities taking advantage of ICT, of course, industrial Internet of Things, but also carbon neutrality, where we can track and assess that solutions are carbon neutral, quantum technology, digital platforms, autonomous vehicles, very interesting. The automotive sector, one could say a car today is a software on four wheels. I would not go that so far.
The automotive industry wants to achieve a software-defined product.
Yes, right. So here you can see the topics we are working on just now, also on, especially on international level, but also to stress out, when you want to participate on international level, we at Austrian Standards are your gateway to the international as well as European standardization system. And since we are speaking about standards, yes. Sorry, you have to stop me there.
No, all good.
Here you can see that standards development organizations, there are a lot of standards development organizations, and you have to do a really due diligence before you apply a standard, where this specification is coming from. And this landscape comes from the IoTI, which is the Alliance of Internet of Things initiative. Dealing with IoT standardization. Here you can see the so-called verticals, for example, home, building, manufacturing, automotive sector, energy, and so on, where we have more or less the devices standardized. And then you have the horizontal sector to ensure that the telecommunication works and so on, cybersecurity aspects, which is also a horizontal topic, and so on. And here you can see very stable, very recognized as standardization organizations like OPC, IEEE, and so on. And also one, if you want to assess the quality of a standardization organization, it's also how such a standardization organization cooperates with other. For example, OPC cooperates with ISO, and they bring their specification to ISO at a certain stage to upgrade their specification to an international standard. So the way these organizations cooperate is also, let's say, a characteristic for their quality.
And I think it's pretty common that standards organizations, reputable standards organizations, basically hand off a standard once it's developed into a so-called ISO fast-track process, so that their standard is then also available with an ISO number and recognized as an international standard. This is pretty common practice. Also for the INCOSI, this organization where I'm the Deputy Director of Standards, this is a way that is very helpful, because it also has one more implication. If you go down the fast-track route, you don't give away your IP. If you work in a classical ISO standard that is only developed by ISO, all the IP goes to ISO basically. And if you do this other approach where another standards organization develops a standard and then puts it into the fast-track process of ISO, the IP stays with the organization that started the fast-track process. So also a consideration. Sometimes it's good to give away IP, especially if you have conflicting problems with competitors and so on. If there is patents involved, it might help the overall market if the patents are basically dissolved and moved into a standard. But there is other cases where there is advantages if the original IP stays with the organization that developed the documents or the models. I think something when we talk about standards and the seeing of the building information model motivated me that there is now more and more standards that are developed in a model-based way. The classical way was always documents, and we see more and more approaches now where the standards are developed as a model, a UML model, so to speak, if you want to be, if you want to relate to it. But it's more and more common now to develop standards as models and then derive a document from said model. So, and you know, I'm more plan at GitHub, and so sometimes I'm really impatient with the pace of standards development. And so my motto is go agile or go extinct. And it's sometimes a bit hard for me to have the patience for standardization, but still I dedicate time to it because I think there's really big value. But I see that there is also more topics that can be developed in the open, that can be developed like a GitHub project, an open source project. As I said, the functional mockup interface for simulatable software components is one of the examples that I know that is very widely used in the industry and very respected. There is no discussion. If you do not support FMI, you cannot sell any product in this simulation, co-simulation space. And so there is things where this agile or more GitHub style makes sense. But obviously, if it goes into more legal binding standards, like for example, the ISO 26222, which is the ISO standards for safety critical software for automotive, the automotive version, where really people can get hurt, and we need a solid basis to judge if the proper way of engineering was applied when accidents happen. It makes absolutely sense to have those standards under ISO regime and that they are recognized worldwide and not just a tag on a GitHub repo. One of the topics that is from the same state of mind, kinda, is the accessibility of standards. It should not be underestimated that this is sometimes a real problem, how standards are accessible. And if we would be in a room now, I would have all university affiliates raise their hand if they work with standards or not. I have the personal feeling that standards are underrepresented in education at the moment. It's sometimes very hard for non-commercial projects to attend, to obtain standards in a legal fashion because they are behind paywalls. Obviously, this makes sense to some extent, but the solutions for learning and studying are not always the best. So, yeah. And the most weird of all problems in this aspect is that very often universities have contracts with ISO or with their regional organization that they can access all the standards. They have a digital library of sorts, but then this is like a secret kept within a few people, a handful of people. And none of the students, none of the lecturers know how to access standards. They start on the dark side of the internet if they need a standard. And it's really not good. If we want to be a standards-driven kind of organization or standards-driven culture that values these best practices, and it's not more than written down best practices after all, then we have to make sure that especially for education and research, standards are very easy to access. And I really like the example from the paper world, from the scientific paper world, that the European Commission highly pushed for free availability of university papers or research papers.
So we hear this message very clearly from us as Austrian Standards. And since many, many years, we are in contact with different universities, but also other educational institutions. And we provide here in the so-called electronic reading room of the libraries of the universities such solutions. We are in some universities, like the Technical University of Austria, they have for all technical universities these electronic reading rooms where students, but also the professors, the teachers and researchers can access the standards, including ISO standards.
Yes, I know.
But I would also, when we speak about universities and educational institutions, not only to provide the standards there to be studied and so on, but also the concept, how these standards elaborated. So standards and standardization, and I hope this message is very clear, it's a very important instrument to strengthen competitiveness, to ensure interoperability. So it's a strategic instrument, but an instrument is only as good as those who use it. So education about standardization is also key, and we provide in some universities lectures about standardization, how standardization is used, how to participate, what to consider, but also how to use standards.
And I'm very happy that you do this, because even if I'm on international conferences, this is very often the feedback that it's so hard for teaching, for education to make standards available. And as I said, if we want a generation of engineers that works more efficient based on best practices, it's really a call to action for everybody involved in education to go the extra mile and involve standards in their education programs. Yeah, and here is another example of a standard, and it's a bit the weird animal in the room. There is this de facto standards that very often come from one very strong competitor, and everybody's talking AI today, so the example I choose is from AI. This is basically the Open AI API, how they defined it with this V1 chat competitions, is a de facto standard how you interact with a large language model at the moment. I have a list here of all the services I found quickly that support the OpenAI API, but it's the whole Azure stack, it's Ollama on your local Mac, it's all these port router services, open router services that all basically support the same API. That means I have a product, in my case SmartGit, and I want to create a solution to create commit messages using LLM. My advantage is, because there is this de facto standard, I only have to implement the OpenAI API, and my product from that day onwards, it's like a bring your own AI approach, can now work with all of these AI providers that implement this. So it's a huge advantage for my customers, because if they run a local instance of an LLM, they can use this. If they have GitHub Copilot license, they can use this. If they use OpenAI, they can use it, and it doesn't really matter. So for me, as a producer of a software that uses LLM for some capabilities, it's a huge advantage, a real business advantage, that there is these standards that evolve from de facto standards. And I think this is something that comes from our both hearts. Very often people moan about standards. The real question is, did you ever contribute to one? And contribution can mean you just write issues. You document what you don't like. Is the first step of how to say, contribution. Or you help to vote. You talk to the people that may vote. They are sometimes very happy because they have to review so much stuff. And if you can give them some opinion, like lobbyist, which is a kind of bad job, but yeah, it is what it is, you can really help to drive standards where they are going. And also, if you document in your products that you adapted some standards, that you work according to best practices, always an advantage. And we all know this hassles that we have to go through with cybersecurity certifications and so on. This is also something where it's a competitive advantage. If as a small company, I can show I have an ISO standard for my cybersecurity in my organization. It's already better when I want to sell to big organizations. So these things really help you to be more successful in the market, and this is first-hand experience.
Yes, indeed. So be part of the solution, be involved. Sharing is caring. That's in our DNA of standardization. So if you're interested, now you know me, you know Austrian Standards, and I look forward to hear from you. And yes, be active.
Thank you.
For the invitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.